Hello, this is Father Bill Watson, and this is a question for our YouTube channel, Ask Father Bill. And today's question's a doozy. What can be done to replace a scrupulous tendency with trust in God's unconditional mercy? Very good question, and a very tough issue in the spiritual life. I've known many people, sometimes myself, who have suffered from great scrupulosity, and it's quite painful. But I think the person who suffered the most that I know of the saints is St. Ignatius Loyola. He made his whole life confession in the early part of his conversion, and then he didn't think he had confessed honestly enough. So he confessed again. And he thought that wasn't pure or correct, and so he confessed again. And he kept finding new and more nuanced dimensions of sins that he thought he had not honestly confessed. And he went through a 3-month period, as far as my research in examining his conversion process, a 3-month period of absolute emotional, intense suffering from his scrupulosity over not being able to confess properly. And he even came to the point, he said, of wanting to throw himself off the cliff where he prayed. And the proud Basque soldier who had led a charge with 400 Basque against 10,000 French got to the point of such profound suffering in his scrupulosity that he said that if he could be fixed by just following a little dog around, he would do it. And then one day he just got so disgusted with his conversion process. He tried everything, fasting all night long, going to the best spiritual guides, being told not to confess again unless he was positive that there was something that was sinful, mortally sinful, that he hadn't confessed. He said, this did no good for me because everything he thought of was sinful. And then he just thought, I'm going to go back to the court life. And then he said, where did that thought come from? And it says in the autobiography, this is the tipping point in the autobiography and in his personal spiritual development. From that point forward, he ceased the habit of confessing his past sins. I talked with the great George Aschenbrenner, who wrote a recommendation for my book, Sacred Story, about this particular juncture in the autobiography in St. Ignatius's life. And I said, it's the tipping point. I said, had he not moved beyond that scrupulous tendency, he would have been a byline in history, a mid-level royal that may have been a footnote. And so what made him move forward? He was given an insight by grace. And this insight becomes the kernel of the whole rules for the second week of discernment in the spiritual exercises, which is, how can something that begins right get twisted and turn you away from God? And St. Ignatius says what you have to do is you have to trace back a thought to its origins to see where you had gone off. So it seemed like a good spiritual thing to confess honestly and to confess well. But this is where the enemy weaseled himself into Ignatius's life. The old sin of pride that had brought him to the point of getting hit by a cannonball, that he did not see in this seemingly holy practice of honest and good confession. So what he said, from that point forward, he ceased the habit of confessing his past sins. What he was actually saying in the autobiography is that he couldn't, with any amount of discipline, exercise, or mortification, purify himself. And he simply had to trust that God would be his merciful forgiver. Toward the end of his life, Ignatius said that he thought scruples were rooted in pride. because people who are proud try to do everything themselves spiritually, and they become very self-righteous. And they can't see their self-righteousness and their pride because they're acting so perfectly, fulfilling the law so perfectly, but they're doing everything themselves, and they don't need God as a Savior. So what can be done to replace a scrupulous tendency with trust in God's unconditional mercy? Well, first, possibly admit that you might be proud at heart, and that you might, through your scrupulous tendency, be trying to, with your own efforts, save yourself, because it's so hard for you to admit that you might need Jesus as Savior. Surrender your pride and surrender to the unconditional mercy of Jesus, who is the only one who can save you. And I hope that helps.